Hi everyone, and welcome to our chapter on biomes and biodiversity, chapter 10. This is a really fun chapter where we will be taking a look at the different types of ecosystems that are distributed over our planet. So in this chapter, we'll define biome and explain how biomes are related to climate. We'll explain how climate is related to biodiversity of biomes and the adaptations of organisms. We will describe how terrestrial biomes are classified and distributed across the globe. We'll outline abiotic and biotic factors contributing to terrestrial biomes, describe how aquatic biomes are divided by zones, and list types of aquatic organisms, describe how aquatic biomes differ from one another, describe the classification system for conservation status, describe biodiversity and its related terms, and last but not least, identify the benefits of biodiversity to humans. So heading into this chapter, you may already have some sense of what a biome is, and you may even be able to name some specific biomes. But before we can talk about the different biomes, we need to define what a biome is and also talk about the variables that give a biome their particular characteristics. So biomes are groups of similar ecosystems that cover a large area characterized by a distinct vegetation, soil type, climate, and wildlife. The factors that determine which biome exists in a particular region, the main one is the climate of that region. And remember from our climate chapter that climate is defined as the average weather conditions over a long period of time, which includes conditions pertaining to temperature, moisture, meaning both precipitation and humidity, air pressure, cloud cover, and wind. So these things, the climate dictates the biome. But what determines the climate? So remember again from our climate chapter that climate is brought about by three main factors: insolation, albedo, and greenhouse gases. So when different biomes have different climates, that means that these regions have variations in these factors, namely insolation and albedo. And those variations are brought about by the latitude of the region, meaning its distance from the equator, the altitude of the region, meaning its distance above sea level, and a couple of other factors play in as well, including the proximity of the biome to the ocean and its proximity relative to mountain ranges. And out of all the aspects of climate that determine a biome, temperature and moisture are the two predominant ones. So we're going to talk in more detail about these two and the patterns that we see in temperature and moisture levels across the biomes of the world. On Earth, temperature generally falls on a gradient, wherein hotter temperatures are observed at the equator and colder temperatures are observed at the poles. So remember from our climate chapter that this is because the equator gets a lot more concentrated insolation compared to the poles, which receive their sunlight at a more dispersed angle. And based on this temperature gradient, several different zones have been designated on Earth based on their latitude. So tropical zones are the most equatorial ones. They're located anywhere between the equator, which is defined as being 0 degrees latitude, up to 23 degrees north, which is a latitude line that we call the Tropic of Cancer, or 23 degrees south, which is a latitude line that we call the Tropic of Capricorn. And above and below tropical zones, you'll find temperate zones. And these zones are located between 23 degrees and 67 degrees north and south. So we in Arizona live in what's considered a temperate zone. And within the temperate zone, there is also a smaller zone called the subtropical zone. So the subtropical zone is considered part of the temperate zone, but it generally has a warmer and drier climate than the rest of the temperate zone. And the subtropical zone it's not very well defined in terms of latitude. There's some disagreement on what consists of the subtropical zone, but it's generally considered to extend between 23 to 25 degrees and 35 to 40 degrees north and south. And then lastly, Arctic zones include everything from 67 degrees north and south up and down to the poles. And as we said before, as you advance upward and downward through these zones, temperatures generally tend to get colder the farther away you move from the equator. But it's also not just about latitude. there are other factors that come into play in temperature as well. One of these is altitude. So not only does temperature fall in a gradient from the equator to the poles, it also falls in a gradient from lower altitudes to higher altitudes. So biomes at lower altitudes, in other words, lower elevations, tend to be warmer, and ones at higher altitudes tend to be colder. And this illustration here shows how different biomes tend to be arranged relative to elevation above sea level, with tropical rainforests occurring closest to sea level, followed by temperate forests, then taiga, then tundra, and then polar ice caps at the highest elevation. Proximity to oceans also makes a difference. So coastal regions tend to have less extreme temperatures than landlocked regions of the same latitude and elevation. And this is because water in the ocean moderates the ambient temperature. It makes winters less cold and it makes summers less hot. So all seasons generally tend to be more mild in nature if you're in a biome that's adjacent to the ocean compared to landlocked regions. So this fills you in on some of the ways that temperature varies across the different parts of the Earth. The other major variable that we mentioned besides temperature that determines a biome is moisture. So biomes get classified with one of 4 different descriptors based on their moisture levels. Arid biomes are the driest, followed by semi-arid, then semi-humid, and then the biomes with the most moisture are considered humid. The moisture level in a particular biome is brought about by several things. Evaporation levels, which are a factor of how much heat the area gets from insolation, the proximity of the area to a body of water, because as we learned about in the water cycle, bodies of liquid water are the source of water vapor that evaporates and then turns into precipitation. And then global wind patterns also determine where moist versus dry air tends to coalesce. For example, you may remember when we touched on Hadley cells back in our chapter about atmosphere and air pollution. So the Hadley cell is this well-defined convection cell which takes place between the equator and 30 degrees north and south latitudes. And it's brought about by the fact that the regions around the equator get more direct sunlight. And so the ocean there experiences more evaporation, and that warm, moist air rises. And in this process, as it gets higher in the atmosphere, it cools down and condenses and then drops its moisture as rainfall. So now the air is dry, and it keeps traveling through the atmosphere until it descends in the regions around the 30-degree north and south latitude. And lo and behold, because of this phenomenon, most of the world's major desert biomes are found around 30 degrees north and south because the influx of dry air and the absence of moisture that occurs with these Hadley cells. So in the northern hemisphere, the Sonoran Desert, where we live, is one of those deserts. In the southern hemisphere, the Sahara Desert in Africa is an example of this phenomenon manifesting. So 30 degrees north and south tends to be dry because of the Hadley cells. So do the polar regions, but for a different reason. Polar regions are dry because cold air is not capable of holding very much moisture. So there's not sufficient water vapor being carried in the air to bring about high levels of precipitation at the poles. Another variable that affects moisture levels in a biome is the topography of the land, chiefly in areas that flank large mountain ranges. Because when you have a tall mountain range, it can bring about something called a rain shadow, which is what's being depicted in this illustration. If one side of the mountain range tends to get an influx of humid air, such as from being adjacent to the ocean, for example, the wind will carry that humid air up the mountain, and as the air travels upward in altitude, it cools off. And we know that when this happens, when the air cools off, the moisture condenses out as rainfall or snowfall. So now the air is dry, but it keeps traveling, it keeps getting pushed over the top of the mountain, and by the time it reaches the other side of the mountain, there's no moisture left to facilitate precipitation. And this dry region on the opposing side of the mountain, what's called the leeward side of the mountain, is called a rain shadow. And then finally, the geography of a region and how far away it is from the coast also plays a role in moisture patterns. The farther inland, the drier it tends to be, because the air has to travel a farther distance from the ocean to reach that area, and it loses most of its evaporated moisture by the time it gets there. So that gives you a sense of some of the moisture patterns that play into biomes. And when you take these two things together, moisture and temperature, there are certain trends that are observed in the distribution of biomes across the world in terms of a specific moisture level and a specific temperature level tending to yield a certain biome. So in this figure, we have the average annual temperature plotted on the x-axis and the annual precipitation level plotted on the y-axis. And as you can see, if we look at the highest temperatures on the farthest right side of the graph around the 30-degree mark, there are 3 different biomes stacked up here, and which one you get depends upon the precipitation. So the highest precipitation combined with the highest temperature yields a tropical rainforest. High temperatures and somewhat lower precipitation levels yield tropical seasonal forests or savannas, and then high temperatures with low precipitation is a subtropical desert. That's where we are. And then looking at slightly lower temperatures, the wettest biomes in the mid-range temperatures are temperate rainforests. Slightly drier than that are temperate seasonal forests, then woodland/shrubland, then temperate grassland and cold deserts. And then among the coldest biomes are boreal forests and tundras at the farthest left part of the temperature scale. And it's probably no surprise to you that these temperature and moisture conditions are what determine the type of organisms that can survive in a region, starting at the very most basic level with what plants can survive in a particular region. Plants play a really critical role in ecosystems and in biomes because they are the producers. Everything else in the ecosystem relies on them all the way up the food chain, either directly or indirectly. So plants are the foundation of a biome. And what type of plants can grow in a biome is related to the biome's growing season. The growing season is defined as the time period each year when it's warm enough for plants to grow. Arctic biomes have a growing season that is only a couple of months long because for the remaining portion of the year, everything is frozen. Whereas tropical biomes often have a year-round growing season as long as there's enough precipitation to support that kind of activity. Another factor that plays into plant growth is soil nutrition. And Arctic zones tend to have very poor nutrient soil because the cold temperatures mean that any organic material in the region decomposes very slowly. So it does not break down quickly and re-enter the cycle in order to support other living things and provide nutrition. Interestingly, tropical zones tend to suffer the same problem. They have poor nutrient soil because it's so warm and wet that organic material decomposes too rapidly, and also because the high levels of precipitation in these zones tends to wash away the nutrients that are produced from the decomposing organisms. Temperate zones strike a nice middle ground between these shortcomings of Arctic and tropical zones in terms of soil nutrition. These areas tend to be the most fertile across the globe. And then a final factor that plays into plant growth is the seasonality of precipitation. Some areas have one rainy season that generates most of the precipitation for the entire year. An example of this is California. The months of December through March in California account for the vast majority of precipitation that takes place in the state. In Arizona, this is also true. We have the monsoon season in June through September, and that produces most of our rain. Other places, though, get a steady precipitation year-round. And this kind of pattern, of course, supports different types of plants than you would find in a biome that has limited seasonal rainfall. So the New England area of the northeastern US is an example of a place that experiences year-round precipitation. So, in summary, the growing season, soil nutrition, and precipitation patterns, these are all a product of the region's climate, and all these things dictate which plants are able to grow and survive in a particular biome. Because plants are the producers and all of the other levels of the food chain are linked to them, either directly or indirectly, the plant life then influences the number and variety of other organisms that can be supported within a biome, or in other words, the biome's biodiversity. Biodiversity refers to the number of different species of organisms in a biome. And typically, higher biodiversity levels occur in warmer biomes and also in wetter biomes. Therefore, in line with what we know now about the characteristics of the Earth's different regions, biodiversity is the highest in tropical zones, especially tropical rainforests, which are warm and wet, and lowest in Arctic zones, which are cold and dry. But whatever the conditions in a biome, the organisms that live there have to evolve adaptations to those conditions. And they'll adapt to the abiotic, meaning the non-living factors, which include temperature, moisture, the growing season length, and the soil quality. So for example, as you probably know, many of the plants that you'll find in the Sonoran Desert have special mechanisms that allow them to store water for long periods of time. And then plants in cold regions will show a dormancy cycle where they shed their leaves and their growth slows down considerably during the period in between growing seasons. Other plants have adapted to low light conditions, or maybe they're especially good at pulling nutrients out of poor nutrient soils. And animals exhibit adaptations to these factors too, of course. We'll be talking much more about biodiversity in our final section of this chapter, but in our next section, we are going to be taking some of the general trends that we've learned here about the features of biomes and exploring the different types of terrestrial biomes that we see on our planet in detail.